blanket the Australian state of New South Wales, transforming day into night.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels,
The federal
upon
government
the
is
levers.
cracking down on UK terrorism and being followed closely by the state. For the second time in a week, a young immigrant child has died while in custody of the U.S.
I'm here to help protect the water for the future generation. We come here to die. We have to.
Well, greetings, friends. Welcome to Fight Like an Animal. This is a podcast about biology and politics, and not about those two things in parallel. So a typical episode would not, for instance, consist of a discussion of how jellyfish reproduce, followed by a discussion of why Joe Biden is a terrible presidential candidate. It's about what those two things have to do with one another. And I'm coming from a movement perspective. So I guess specifically, this is intended to be a synthesis of social movement strategy and thinking around that and evolutionary theory and how it applies to human behavior. And I think that this is a synthesis that, in my experience, has been totally systemically and programmatically just avoided. And I think that the reason for that isn't because it's too conceptually dazzling for anybody to have stumbled upon it. I don't think that the kind of like baseline notion that in order to affect different collective behavioral outcomes within our species, it might be helpful to have an understanding of the baseline behavioral biology of our species is really that much of a stretch for that many people. But I think that evolutionary theory has been pretty reflexively avoided by people in social movements because people are afraid of what it implies. Because I think that people who are trying to make a better world are often very afraid that human nature, if looked at too closely, will indicate to them that the world that they want to create is impossible. And I think that that's a very understandable fear, because I think that a close examination of human nature definitely does indicate that utopia isn't right around the corner. But the point that I'd make is that utopia is pretty manifestly, apparently, not right around the corner anyway. And that coming to terms with difficult realities might be the only way to preserve any life on Earth at all. I mean, I think that if there were ever a time when external objective conditions had regressed to a point where we could really say that social movement strategy, as we've ever known it, has failed. And that if there was a way to reevaluate kind of like core assumptions, like fundamental, often unarticulated paradigms from which the strategies emerge, whereby we try to intervene in the socio-political trajectory, I think that the time has come. I mean, we live within the margin of error for self-perpetuating climate change, meaning that if you take the overall carbon budget that even really conservative entities who are absolutely soft-pedaling the severity of the crisis we're in, like the IPCC, if you take the carbon budget that they articulate for any chance of staying within a couple degrees of average global temperature rise and any chance of preventing kind of like runaway self-perpetuating climate change, and then you take all the geophysical uncertainties that they acknowledge, all the uncertainties in how much, for instance, like methane is going to be released by melting permafrost and things like that, how much of a feedback loop we're going to get from forests burning at what temperatures and stuff like that. The margin of error exceeds the carbon budget. So that's another way of saying that self-perpetuating ecological collapse of the kind that characterized the Earth's previous 5 mass extinctions, where in some cases up to 97% of species went extinct, and the sky turned a different color from the release of poisonous gas that was a metabolic byproduct of some of the few organisms that were remaining in the end Permian, the so-called mother of all extinctions. You know, if we are already in terrain where that might be inevitable. So it's hard for me to imagine a set of conditions that could really get much worse while there's still people walking around, breathing, and having conversations like this. That would allow us to say, like, okay, well, maybe now we can say that social movements have failed. They have simply failed. They've done amazing things. I've participated in them for 2.5 decades, and it's been a wild ride. We've had some great adventures. We've done some beautiful things, and I really can't overstate the depth of love that I have for the people who have struggled and sacrificed with me to try to make a better world, but we've lost. We have not succeeded in. We've had some incredible local successes, right? We have fought against the construction of new oil terminals and won, or we have militated for a minimum wage increase in a given city and won, or whatever, but on any kind of cumulative, like, sort of overall, in any kind of systemic analysis of how things have gone, we failed. And so I guess I think that the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this series is going to push some buttons and challenge some core assumptions of people with whom I share a good deal of moral and political common ground. And I'm just going to ask as non-combatively and as kind of like humbly as I can that you consider just sort of engaging that discomfort. I'm not saying don't assess what I'm saying critically. By all means, assess what I'm saying with razor scrutiny. Absolutely, always. What anybody tells you ever, for sure. But I'm asking you to consider allowing yourself to contemplate the reality of things that make you uncomfortable and see if it doesn't allow you to go down paths of analysis and paths of strategic thought and internal psychological reconfigurations that feel qualitatively different from the kinds of strategic social movement discussions and paths that you're familiar with. And again, if they do, then I would say maybe it's really worth considering going on this ride with me and considering some of the implications of what I'm saying as something to incorporate into your life and whatever work you're doing or considering doing. Because what we've been doing just hasn't been working. So this first thing that I'm going to do will be a 3-part series. And it comes out of, I guess ultimately, I started when I was a teenager being involved in socio-political conflicts where it felt to me very apparent that the political conflict per se was kind of like a very surface manifestation of some pretty profound differences that existed between people who had different perceptions of a political issue, and that those differences were kind of unarticulated and unconscious by all parties. And I found myself really wondering kind of just like what the ultimate origins of political difference were. And in parallel, I've always read a lot of scientific papers, and a lot of them have been about evolutionary theory and biology. And 10 years ago, pretty exactly, I started reading a lot about the biology of domestication, which is the biology of aggression and the biology of development and wholesale developmental changes. and how they affect not just aggression, but aspects of physical appearance and behavioral plasticity, the desire for seeking out novelty, a whole bunch of other things that I'll get into. And I didn't really think that had any remote application to that question of where political difference ultimately comes from. Sometime in 2016, having gone down a bunch more seemingly unrelated academic pathways, I had a moment where I felt like I spontaneously and decisively could see a whole bunch of really disparate information that I had encountered from really disparate sources, cohering into like one sort of comprehensive explanatory framework that potentially provided a pretty compelling answer to that question of the ultimate origins of political difference. And 2016 and 2017 were both years of very like fervent, nomadic, 18-hour-a-day organizing. So I had absolutely no time to do any kind of remotely academic work at all. 2018, if you've spent much of your life organizing or you know organizers, you're probably familiar with the cycle. 2018 was very much the like depressive phase of the manic depressive cycle of organizing, right? It was just like the time when it felt too painful to continue, and that does happen. And so I ended up with a bunch of time, and so I started really looking into the science of political difference per se, which is approached from a bunch of different disciplines, with a bunch of different, really different methods, all kind of like converging on some set of pretty interrelated findings. So cognitive science, brain imaging studies, also just the whole domain of political psychology, where they ask people to describe their kind of baseline psychological realities, and then they correlate all these tendencies that don't have any explicit relationship with politics, all these just sort of like very fundamental perceptual orientations to political orientation. And what I read really gave me the impression that I was onto something. So in 2019, I wrote a scientific paper. I wrote a literature review that's just a pure act of synthesis. I didn't do any primary research. I didn't conduct any experiments or ask anybody any questions or do any statistical analysis or anything like that. I just kind of compared two domains of scientific literature that I don't think had really seen much comparison before. So developmental biology on the one hand, and then political psychology and all those related disciplines on the other. In that paper, I really don't know how to characterize its status, and I think that if I did, it would be highly and somewhat meaninglessly revealing of my own internal psychological dynamics, but it's done. The paper has been written for quite a while now, and I absolutely know exactly which journal I want to send it to. I have formatted it for submission to that journal, made an account with that journal. I am in the stage, have been in the stage for months, where the work that remains is to like press send, and for whatever reason that's proving to involve navigating some internal barriers that are much stronger than I really ever could have imagined. But someday I'll send the paper off. And in any case, the actual point is that this series is based on that paper. And all the science that I'll cite in it, I mean, I'm posting a bibliography online, but all the science that I'm citing in it is cited in that paper. Okay. And so this series is called The Biology of the Right-Left Divide, the Relationship Between Ideology, Tactics, and Paths to Power, and this is part 1. So, in this series, I'm going to present a theory of where political conflict ultimately comes from. And I do think it's very fascinating on its own inherent terms. I don't think that I would have read all the science it's based on and developed the theory if I didn't find it pretty intrinsically fascinating. But what I do want to emphasize at the outset is that for as much as we are going to navigate a bunch of really far-flung scientific obscurities to get there, as much as we're going to talk about why bonobos have more sex than chimpanzees and why people who vote Republican are more afraid of pictures of spiders than people who vote Democrat, and all this other stuff, this is ultimately a theory of power, right? It's not just about where political conflict comes from. It's also about why political conflict plays out the way that it does and who wins what kind of power under what circumstances. So I'm going to review the science of political difference, and by that I mean the science that looks at what differences in traits like fear of death and brain structure and physiology, in other words, traits that don't have any very explicit, logically inevitable relationship with politics, nonetheless correlate with political outlook. And then I'm going to review a bunch of biology. I'm going to review the biology of aggression, which is also the biology of social tolerance and novelty seeking and a whole bunch of other things. And I'll describe all the aspects of politics that seem to be perfectly predicted by a theory which states that political difference emerges from developmental difference related to aggression. I know that statement likely doesn't mean a whole lot at the very moment, but developing it and justifying it and substantiating it is the purpose of the series. So then finally, I'm going to present my conclusions on what all this implies for sociopolitical outcomes, what it implies for who gets power under what circumstances. And I also want to emphasize that as much as this is based on reading a lot of science, as much as it's based on the synthesis of two different domains of scientific literature, it's also empirically grounded in the reality of organizing. It comes from observations of how different types of people with different kind of like very basic cognitive makeups, very different basic perceptual orientations, and consequently very different belief systems also tend to pursue their objectives or fight for their beliefs in different ways. I'm recording from coronavirus quarantine, and so as I'm recording, in one sense it's perfectly fair to say that the terms in which we can conceive of organizing for a better world are radically shifting. And then on the other hand, I think it's also perfectly fair to say that everything is pretty much the same as it ever is. So in the radically shifting category, I mean, sure, the pandemic has achieved the first significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions since the last time the global economy fell apart. Obviously, people are dying in really significant numbers. A bunch of policies that were totally unthinkable a month ago or so are now the subject of very mainstream discourse. So everything is changing rapidly and radically, but then in the everything is the same category, it's certainly true that the suffering, that the economic collapse the pandemic has created, that suffering could be avoided. The evictions and the scarcity and just all the like horrors that we're starting to witness here in the United States of America could be avoided if the people in power were actually kind of motivated to prevent suffering, and they're just not. And, once again, the objective physical reality of shared crisis isn't really doing anything to negate the reality of polarization in our society. So partisanship is, once again, the strongest predictor of perceptions of and responses to this pandemic, just like partisanship is the strongest predictor of perceptions of climate change and other objective physical realities of shared crisis. So I think that one could certainly say that it's a time of unprecedented crisis and not be wrong, but it also just really does feel to me like we kind of ran out of synonyms for words like unprecedented and crisis a little while ago, right? It feels like commentators, if you were following climate change, maybe that started happening about 10 years ago, where it really felt like people, commentators, scientists, and the like just kind of started to run out of ways to say this is happening faster than we thought, this is unprecedented, this is a crisis. Maybe, if you were following the social trajectory more closely than the ecological one, if you were following news related to the core institutions that kind of like comprise civilization, it might have been like 5 years ago or something. Certainly the Trump election shifted that a lot for a lot of people, where it just felt like there was a nonstop barrage of people saying that we are in an unprecedented crisis, and it really stopped feeling very unprecedented to hear that terminology. So I would say that the crisis that we're in now, in terms of the range of conceivable responses, is subject to the exact same sharp limitations as all the other crises that precede it. And those limitations, of course, are the dynamics of power in our society. They're the same. They are fundamental and unvarying, whether we're talking about whether people are going to starve and get evicted during this pandemic, or whether we're talking about the collapse of the global ecosystem, or whether we're talking about the United States starting World War III, or the distribution of wealth, whatever. Right? So I think that to put it in terms which just completely lack pointless academic elaboration as much as possible, there's two fundamental questions that emerge in all these situations where we're trying to shape the world in some fashion, where we're trying to affect a socio-political outcome. The first of these is why people's beliefs and political behaviors exist as they do. I told you that I'd phrase these simply. And then the second is how people with different beliefs fight in different ways to achieve their ends, and what that says about who wins what kind of power. And I think that ideological priorities have really significantly impeded us from asking these questions in a kind of just very basic, systemic, coherent way. I think that ideological priorities have prevented us from asking these questions in a way that would kind of be square one, like a basic framework from which any strategy should emerge. I think that anybody who's not too encumbered by a head full of social theory that says otherwise can see with the evidence of their own senses that there are some pretty fundamental differences between people, and that ideology per se is just one manifestation of those differences. I think that one way this is intuitively apparent is from the experiential reality of political debate. Right? If people were arriving at their political orientations as a result of some kind of purely rational, deliberative, like evaluative process, then they would enter into political arguments with different sets of information in their head and having been exposed to different arguments, and then political debates would expose them to new information and new forms of argumentation, and that would have the effect of actually changing people's minds sometimes. But that's not really what we experience. In fact, arguments about politics in our experience tend to make people commit to their positions with greater fervor. And this fact alone, that people are capable of arguing pretty indefinitely along very recurrent thematic lines, should be sufficient to convince most of us that people don't disagree simply because they've been exposed to different information or arguments or cultural frames of reference or whatever, right? What seems to be happening from our lived experience is that people have some pretty deeply ingrained perceptual biases towards certain forms of political thought, and that they actually kind of like go out and gather evidence and arguments that reinforce their political orientation rather than developing a political orientation as the result of some kind of methodical scrutiny of arguments and evidence. And there is a lot of scientific research indicating that this intuitive conclusion is valid. There's a lot of research indicating that political outlook is fundamentally not rational, in that it correlates with basic physiological and cognitive tendencies much better than it does with variation in people's external conditions. But in a life of political organizing, variation in external conditions is all I've ever heard referenced in terms of why people think and act as they do and how they could be mobilized to think and act otherwise, and just generally how sociopolitical outcomes can be shifted. And really, no matter how sophisticated the language and the theory I've encountered in any given organizing setting, and I definitely have organized in some settings where people were really fond of throwing around very sophisticated language and theory, I've never encountered serious discussion of the innate aspects of political behavior. I've only ever encountered the implicit assumption or the explicit statement that all people are more or less equipotential to come to any given conclusion or behave in any given way or perceive any given moral truth or whatever. I don't think this assumption has any justification whatsoever, and I think that the strategies that emerge from it will always lack a fundamental coherence. In this series, I'm mostly going to shy away from personal anecdotes. I think it can be really tedious. I don't want to do a lot of the weary aging organizer thing of being like, well, back in the day when the world was young and there was hope in the air, we did this one awesome thing, blah, blah, blah. But I am going to indulge in a few anecdotes that I think illustrate exactly this point of how kind of like core assumptions about human nature or the lack thereof, however unarticulated they are within social movement theory, actually really do inform social movement strategy in ways that I think are often pretty catastrophic. So, I became curious about the science of political difference when I was a teenager in the Earth First movement as it existed about 25 years ago. So this was the 90s, and it was already the sixth mass extinction, but it was still the age of finite, discrete environmental harms. And by that I mean that systemic, self-perpetuating ecological collapse was not a palpable contemporary reality at all. We knew that we were on a trajectory to that, but we didn't even know the mechanisms by which it would occur. It wasn't at all clear that climate would be the one of the many overarching threats that would come to define the trajectory to collapse. We thought that, most scientists thought that what's happening with climate now was probably going to happen like 100 years from now or so, right? And so there were other perfectly viable candidates for the kind of immediate mechanisms to create a situation of self-perpetuating ecological collapse, including simply like a cascade of extinctions from habitat loss, that people would just dam enough rivers and cut down enough forests and build enough shopping malls that it would unleash a cascade of extinctions of interdependent species that would become unstoppable at some point. And so I'm saying this because to illustrate why to so many of us, because it feels so quaint now, that phase just feels so much more innocent. And it's hard, as much as I experienced it as such a primary and just emotionally and psychologically powerful reality, it's really hard on some level in the situation we're in now for me to remember what it was like to feel so motivated to stop threats to very specific places and specific species, to stop them from logging a given forest which an endangered species inhabited. But to a lot of people at the time, that felt like the most meaningful way to intervene in the overall ecological crisis, was to intervene in specific threats to specific places and species. And so at this time, Earth First was a very vibrant entity, and it had campaigns of disruptive direct action against resource extraction all over the world. And in the U.S., these campaigns were typically either on federal public land, so like national forests and the like, or they were on private industrial forest land. But in either case, they were far away from major population centers, and they took place amidst and put us in contact with pretty conservative rural communities. And these communities were almost inevitably very deeply hostile to environmentalism and environmentalists. And there was kind of an Earth First party line about how to interact with people in these communities that was based on the assumption that the reason for their hostility was almost entirely reducible to economics. And specifically, it was because of their own economic dependence on jobs in resource extraction, and that dependence was a function of geography, that those were the jobs that were available to them. And so we had all these protocols for interaction that involved, assuring people we weren't trying to steal their job, that we were on their side, talking points about how the corporations they worked for mistreated their workers. And we did actually have a bunch of really good data to back up our arguments. Our arguments were actually very cogent. The resource extraction corporations that we were fighting really had been automating and outsourcing such that they were putting far more people out of work for profit than environmentalists were to save the world. And then likewise, the federal timber sale program, so much of the Earth First paradigm was about fighting logging. And the federal timber sale program lost money. And so that created a viable framework for discussions about restructuring existing budgets to put people to work restoring forests instead of cutting them down. But I tried these arguments out on, like an enraged conservative shrieking death threats and nonsense about communism and whatever else exactly once before I reflected that the party line just really wasn't valid, and I abandoned it. And there were a couple reasons for this. First of all, while some people who were hostile to us were employed in resource extraction, I would say more people that I encountered who bothered to very actively express some kind of hostility actually weren't. They were just kind of enraged by something far more abstract, by the very conception of shutting down economic activity to protect ecosystems, not by the threat of personally losing a job. And I also reflected that the ostensible demographic predictors of hostility to environmentalism, because I grew up very poor and in rural areas, actually applied better to me than to a lot of the people I was talking to. But I think that even more fundamentally, it was just really obvious that there were a bunch of other differences between Earth Firsters and the people we were in conflict with, and that differences in perceptions of environmental issues was just one aspect of this kind of vast landscape of distinctions. So Earth Firsters were generally really adventurous. We tended to travel and have lives kind of pretty deliberately constituted around the pursuit of novelty and stimulation. We were courageous. We were willing to take very palpable risks with our lives. People shot at us. People tried to run us over with trucks. Occasionally people did die in these conflicts. Even the most fervent advocates of violent revolution among us, and there certainly were fervent advocates of violent revolution, didn't seem particularly skilled at violence or to ever resort to it out of anger. And then Earth Firsters also tended to perceive the world in terms of interconnection. And ecology was certainly a primary way that this manifested. We would talk a lot about we would talk a lot about how you can't change one aspect of the ecosystem without changing the whole. But this was also true in terms of social outlook. Earth Firsters just prioritized knowing lots of people, having deep relationships. They just tended to think in terms of social totalities. And the people who we were in conflict with really did have very opposite, very pronouncedly opposite tendencies in a number of these regards. So they tended to be pretty suspicious of new experiences in general, just of any kind of novel stimulus. And they would explicitly state to us a desire to live a very stable life in a very small social group, in a predictable setting, where they could be free from contact with outsiders. They talk about how they just kind of wanted to be left alone, and with their core community that they had ever known. They were also very visibly fearful in situations where there wasn't any palpable threat to them at all, and where people were actually assuring them that no harm, that nobody wanted to harm them. But then they also had a much greater tendency to physically harm people out of anger. I never saw an Earth Firster punch a logger, but I definitely saw some loggers take swings at Earth Firsters. But so for all these indications that something deeper was going on than just a difference in economics or geography or whatever, the notion that the only thing separating radical environmentalists and radical right-wingers was that one final decisive conversation about evil logging companies consumed just huge amounts of resources and strategic energy and focus. And I think that more than the direct impact it had in taking up our time and energy, it had this kind of broadly insidious effect in shaping the frame of reference in which we conceived of strategy. I think that this anecdote illustrates, as well as any other of a huge number that I could have employed for the same effect, why there would be an ideological motivation to ignore pretty basic questions about what ultimate differences exist between people that manifest as political difference and what this implies for political outcomes. I think that ignoring these questions just really does meet some basic emotional and psychological need. It allows us to tell a story in which the problems of this world are not terribly fundamental, where most people share some version of a kind of essential value system. And then there's this tiny handful of people who are both uniquely insidious and uniquely powerful. And those are the people who have to be fought. So that gives us a really simple and appealing job. Our job becomes, in that situation, to explain to everyone that we're ultimately on the same side and that, corporations and the people inhabiting the government are our true enemy, and then we can all join forces. And that's a really nice story. And obviously, this is not a story that's in any sense unique to Earth First. I mean, if anything, that movement, which was so frequently accused of misanthropy by the right and the left with equal fervor, that movement was more willing to acknowledge baseline kind of imperfections within the human species than most movements that have broadly similar value systems or objectives or whatever. But it's also true that movements with a lot more contemporary relevance than Earth First, which admittedly is kind of a historical artifact at this point, likewise tend to exclusively conceive of political difference in one of two ways, either in terms of identity exclusively, in terms of race, sexual orientation, gender exclusively, or in terms of identity and class. But it's true that both class and identity are pretty terrible predictors of political orientation. For instance, in the 3 U.S. presidential elections between 1996 and 2004, the correlation between income and voting behavior was below the threshold of statistical insignificance. In contrast, the correlation between scores on one of the metrics from psychology's Big Five personality dimensions, the dimension of openness, was very strongly predictive. And I know in these years there were many, many conversations and movements framed by questions like, how do we unite the working class against the capitalists, right? And I think that there were absolutely none that were framed by questions like, how do we unite people who are seeking novelty and stimulation against people who are behaviorally rigid, because this correlates with everything we care about politically? And I don't know if that sounds absurd to you, but the latter approach really would be far more scientific than the former. And when it's not attenuated by an understanding of the variation within any given group, I think identity is just as chaotic a basis for organizing, because any given oppressed group contains people who are capable of perpetuating the same oppressions they are currently experiencing. For example, among Israelis and Palestinians, for as many legitimate cultural differences as may exist between them, scores on the exact same test, the right-wing authoritarianism scale, predict the extent to which destruction or conquest of the other ethnicity is seen as desirable. And this certainly isn't to say that the subjugation of the Palestinian people by Israel isn't terrible and cruel. It very emphatically is. I'm just saying that the same capacities for ethnocentrism and xenophobic conquest exist within both groups, and that if the power differential were reversed, the direction of oppression would likely be reversed as well. And I chose this example because the nation of Israel was, after all, created after the Jewish people suffered one of the most terrible persecutions in human history. So it illustrates the point. But the right-wing authoritarianism scale wasn't developed specifically for the Israel-Palestine conflict. It comes out of a legacy of academic research into the psychology of authoritarianism that was originally applied to the Nazis. Scores on the right-wing authoritarianism scale also predict voting behavior in the United States better than any other measurable attribute. So the point I'm making is that there's a psychological makeup which is fundamentally prone to creating oppressive social conditions and committing atrocities, and that this psychological makeup is not found in all people, but it is found in some people in all populations. And by saying this, I am not saying that the horrors of human history will inevitably be repeated for as long as humans exist or anything like that. What I'm saying is that if we want to shift human existence towards something less terrible than it's historically been, we need a strategic paradigm that encompasses human nature and the innate variation in it between people. And this statement very directly recapitulates decades of academic argumentation about nature versus nurture. For a century or so, many social scientists perceived a very strict binary. One either posits a blank slate humanity or a humanity confined to repetitions of blindly instinctive behavior. So one either posits a humanity that has inherited nothing from its evolutionary past, has no innate tendencies, and can be reasoned with all the way to utopia right now, or one posits a humanity reflecting nature red in tooth and claw, doomed to tear itself apart until a blinding nuclear flash in the sky makes the whole terrible experiment void and null. And the entire time, biologically oriented scientists were never actually proposing the other side of that binary. They were always insisting that biology provided the framework in which humanity's capacity for variation, which is very obviously substantial, exists, and that you can't understand or influence the variation if you don't understand the underlying biology. And social scientists developed all kinds of pretty ludicrous means of arguing away evolved human nature until toward the end of the 20th century, most of them just kind of gave up. And there were a few reasons for this. I mean, one, the evidence really was just too compelling. But then another was that, and this is a way a lot of science changes. Thomas Kuhn talks about this in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he applies it not just to the social sciences, but to physics and all these other domains of inquiry. But really, too many people who had been wedded to the old paradigm simply died or otherwise exited academic departments. And that is how science changes to some degree. And really there was just too much interesting research to do that actually produced worthwhile results if one incorporated innateness. So while there are some exceptions, social science really abandons social constructivism, but social movement theory doesn't really seem to have caught up. It's honestly difficult to overstate the extent to which activist language and theory and frames of reference tend to very directly recapitulate 20th century anthropology and sociology and critical theory and all the rest. So in a sense, I'm really just trying to do for social movements what other people did for social science in the 90s. If we approach political conflict with the understanding that it reflects innate differences between people, we should expect to see enduring forms of it in different cultures that have been subject to different material and economic and political conditions. This is a primary means by which the innateness of any human trait can be evaluated, right? If a given behavior or social condition is found in every human society ever documented, then that probably says something about the baseline behavioral biology of our species, because there are so many other regards in which all the different societies humans have created do vary in extraordinary and profound ways. One of my favorite books that deals with this is Donald Brown's Human Universals. Brown was an anthropologist in the 20th century social constructivist tradition who changed course because the objective evidence of cross-culturally ubiquitous features of human life was just too convincing. And the book ends, the kind of towering achievement of the book, in my opinion, at the end is this list of slightly less than 50 features which all human societies ever documented possess. It's so interesting. But so as far as political conflict is concerned, some version of the right-left divide can be found throughout time and in pretty radically different settings. One window into this, I guess as good a place to start, is the European Social Survey. The European Social Survey asks questions about basic personal values, which make no reference to anything explicitly political whatsoever. So it's a 10-item scale, and it registers whether someone, for instance, values security over stimulation in their life. And it's all like that. It's a 10-item scale, but it's kind of like 5 axes with opposing poles, right? So scores on this scale predict voting behavior much more strongly than economic status or ethnicity or gender or any of the other ostensible predictors of political behavior focused on in movement strategy. And this is true in European countries with very different contemporary and historic political and economic and material and cultural conditions. So it's true in Western European countries that have a lot of wealth and a long history of secular liberalism and democracy and all that. And it's also true in much poorer Central European countries with a history of the church and the Soviet Union and a sort of general atmosphere of subjugation. And I guess to whatever extent Europe possesses a common history and a shared cultural framework, one could speculate that these results reflect a kind of European construct of left-right politics. But similar findings have been made by a much broader effort called the World Values Survey. The World Values Survey encompasses decades of research on all continents but Antarctica, and has asked nearly 300,000 people in 97 different countries where they place themselves on a left-right ideological spectrum. So 20% of people didn't answer or said they didn't know, and 80% of respondents were comfortable placing themselves somewhere on a 10-point left-right scale. And it's worth noting the response rates were lower in authoritarian countries where people were probably just kind of scared to answer, so the actual proportion of people who can place themselves somewhere on a political spectrum can be assumed to be higher. But even at 80%, this is still very powerful evidence that the left-right divide has enduring cross-cultural meaning. And crucially, it's not just the case that people can place themselves on one side or the other of a divide. It's that they can place themselves on a spectrum. And check this out. In any given nation, or if you take the scores and average them out globally, self-placement on the 10-point left-right scale forms a normal distribution. A normal distribution is the one that people so often refer to as a bell-shaped curve. If one made like a very boring bell that kind of just looks like a normal distribution. But so most people cluster somewhere around the center, and progressively fewer and fewer people describe themselves as existing on the extremes. I think that this is significant because anybody who's trying to achieve meaningful socio-political outcomes knows that simply achieving victory for one side over another side, if your side is dominated by the people closest to the center, is pretty meaningless, right? If the left-right divide is Obama versus McCain or Clinton versus Trump, it's still just a choice between the rhetoric we prefer as we race toward global annihilation. But responses to the World Values Survey tell us that a continuum of political beliefs is an innate human condition. The European Social Survey and the World Values Survey are showing us innateness in different ways. The European Social Survey is illustrating the correlation of some cross-culturally valid construct of right-left politics with a deeper set of underlying perceptual orientations. And the World Values Survey is telling us that whatever these basic perceptual orientations are, well, first of all, they exist kind of everywhere, but second of all, they have a normal distribution. None of the demographic variables which movements use to predict political behavior and around which they organize have normal distributions. Right? Certainly, wealth is a very long way from normally distributed in any society. Those of us in the lowest wealth categories always massively outnumber the people who are in the highest wealth categories. Gender isn't normally distributed. If we're looking for a measurable form of variation in basic perceptual orientation, which might underlie variation in political perceptions, we could do a lot worse than psychology's Big Five personality dimensions. I've already mentioned that one of these dimensions correlated with voting behavior in 3 U.S. presidential elections much better than economics. But the Big Five isn't a construct with exclusive validity in the United States. Researchers have collected scores on the Big Five from about 28,000 people in 36 distinct cultures, from sub-Saharan Africa to Estonia. And they've found that these metrics of personality variation are valid across all these cultures. And there are some group differences, but the variation is ultimately greatest between people within any given culture rather than between the cultural groups themselves. And within any given culture, the distributions of personality scores are normal because they're both cross-culturally universal and normally distributed. These personality types and the variation in these personality types can be very comfortably regarded as biologically innate. And this conclusion has been validated by heritability studies, where researchers determine the genetic contribution of any given trait from IQ to disease susceptibility using the same research paradigm. This research paradigm involves comparing twins who share 100% of their DNA, monozygotic twins, with twins who are like regular siblings and share 50% of their DNA. And so we could make some inferences here. We could say that because scores on the big five personality dimensions correlate with political orientation and are heritable, political orientation is heritable. But we actually don't need to make these kinds of inferences because the same research paradigm of heritability studies comparing twins has also just been applied directly to voting behavior and scores on various psychological survey instruments that are designed to score left-right orientation. And these studies have found that the genetic contribution to ideology is very large. The first study that produced a heritability factor for political orientation was published in 1986. And since then, there's been studies from Minnesota to Australia involving tens of thousands of participants that have all replicated the result. If right-left political conflicts exist cross-culturally, then there must be some core themes around which these conflicts are recurrently organized. And there are, but before I get into them, I guess that this is as good of a time as any to clarify that I'm personally not invested in the right-left divide per se. I've already described my history of ecological politics, and I've made it clear that I see humanity in fundamentally evolutionary terms. I do want to acknowledge there are people who are unequivocally on the left, like Bernie Sanders certainly in his recent presidential campaign, whose agendas I have fervently supported and worked to further. And I absolutely cannot say this for anybody on the right at all. But ultimately, I really do think that the inherent fragmentation in the right-left terminology is very highly revealing. And I'll talk about that more later. But I'm acutely aware that there was a time before the right-left divide, that it only emerges beyond certain thresholds of social and technological complexity. We'll also certainly talk about that more later. And I will always insist that the right-left divide does not characterize all possible futures. I think that in general, politically and just in so many other regards, we live in a society of increasingly disjunct, hyper-localized, mutually incomprehensible frames of reference. And I would like to see a future humanity that is whole, that integrates. So if you're hearing this with some aversion because you think that by talking about the right-left divide, I'm reinforcing it, and you want to transcend it, I guess I just want to say that I am actually right there with you. But that acknowledging that something exists isn't the same thing as identifying with it. And that even if you think right-left politics are kind of stupid, like I do, they just are the empirical reality that must be navigated in any effort to make a different kind of politics emerge. So that said, the enduring core themes of political conflict can be difficult to see in any one given context because some of the themes do change very dramatically and rapidly. So for instance, in pretty recent decades, left-right narratives about local versus federal control have almost entirely reversed. So there was a time when the right supposedly hated the federal government and thought states and counties and cities should be able to make their own policies until they took control of the federal government, right? And then likewise the left, and this tendency really amplified after Trump got elected, lost a lot of hope in achieving policy gains at the federal level and started radically reorienting towards pursuing policies in city councils and state legislatures and the like. So now we have the situation where entities like the ultra-conservative business lobby, the American Legislative Exchange Council, are writing model federal and state preemption bills to prevent smaller political jurisdictions from doing things because they're things they don't want them to do, like banning fracking and raising the minimum wage. And so some meanings of the right-left divide do change over time in between places. But two truly enduring core themes are attitudes towards social change in general and attitudes toward inequality. And what I mean by saying they're core themes is not just that they're persistent in all contexts where right-left politics are found, but that there's such central motivating forces around which conflict is organized that people seem pretty willing to adopt whatever positions on more peripheral issues are necessary for them to take the side that they prefer on these core issues. So again, recall the general claim I'm making that political orientations aren't arrived at by evaluating arguments and evidence. Arguments and evidence are marshaled to support positions which people experience an innate cognitive bias toward. So what I'm saying is that the core cognitive bias is toward questions of inequality and change, and this bias defines perceptions of all the other peripheral issues. And I think the example of federal versus local control illustrates this as a peripheral issue. People have proven perfectly capable of arguing sides of this question on its own terms, as if their motivation was like a rational moral calculation of the question itself. But as the balance of power shifted, they also proved capable of arguing the exact opposite side of the same question. So when opposition to federal control meant opposition to integrating schools, so a maintenance of inequality and a resistance to change, conservatives were opposed to federal control. When state control over cities means the ability to prevent minimum wage increases, again a maintenance of inequality, and a resistance to change as long as you're willing to ignore the radically growing wealth disparities that minimum wages are producing, conservatives suddenly prove not to be such fervent localists after all. In this phrasing, attitudes towards change and attitudes toward inequality is from a 2003 paper that gets cited a lot in political psychology called Conservatism as Socially Motivated Cognition. And it's a meta-analysis of studies performed in 12 countries involving more than 22,000 people, which correlate psychological tendencies with various measures of political orientation. But the authors aren't the only ones to come to this broad conclusion that these are the core themes of the right-left divide. All the psychological survey instruments which are meaningfully statistically predictive of real-world political behavior, so like voting behavior and party identification, as well as self-reported political outlook, like placement on a left-right spectrum, all of these psychological survey instruments ask questions about precisely these themes. The two scales that are used the most often and have the strongest correlations are the C scale, C for conservatism, and the aforementioned right-wing authoritarianism scale. And neither of these scales asks any direct question about any really explicitly political issue per se. They're very abstract inquiries, into general perceptions of hierarchy and comfort with novelty. But despite not asking a single question about, for instance, any environmental issue or any war, responses to these scales strongly predict attitudes toward all environmental issues and to every war the U.S. has participated in since the scales were written decades ago. The C scale doesn't even record responses to fully formed questions. It just asks participants to register a like, dislike, or neutral response to bullet point items like military drill and astrology. And a number of the items like pajama party and computer music have this very distinctly retro quality because the scale was written in the late 60s, and so it refers to cultural phenomena that were, contemporary, relevant, and controversial at the time, but it still very accurately predicts perceptions of contentious socio-political issues as they are currently incarnated. And the right-wing authoritarianism scale is equally abstract. It consists of single-sentence statements that people register a response to, like, what our country really needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. So despite saying nothing whatsoever about immigration, it's strongly predictive of attitudes toward immigration. Despite making no reference of any kind to the death penalty or to warrantless searches or to income inequality or race, it's strongly predictive of perceptions of all of these issues. And so this is the rigorous basis for the statement that the core themes of the right-left divide are hierarchy and social change, attitudes towards inequality and attitudes towards change, comfort with inequality and comfort with novelty. There's a few different ways that it gets phrased, but they all mean essentially the same thing. And it's because answers to these questions about these themes predict attitudes toward all other right-left conflicts with really considerable statistical power. And nobody's ever stumbled on a theme you can ask people about that produces stronger results, that has stronger correlation coefficients, or correlation coefficients that are really anywhere close. And I think that this illustrates pretty well why political debate doesn't change people's minds. Because if people are arriving at their specific political positions because of core orientations to a few very broad themes that nobody's ever really talking about, the arguments about the facts involved in any more kind of like surface manifestation of their orientations to these very broad themes are essentially meaningless, right? And I think that there's one other theme that both of these scales do ask about, but that isn't as explicitly and independently assessed in the literature on political psychology, and that's sexuality, and specifically sexual acts which are not constituted around reproduction. So the C scale registers reactions to items like striptease show and nudist camps. Again, it is pretty hard to overstate how much at this point the C scale does have this kind of like fun retro feel to it. And then the right-wing authoritarianism scale makes statements about pornography and homosexuality and, quote, God's laws concerning marriage. And of course conservatives, because they're conservatives, and this is a core orientation for them, tend to claim that the sexual practices that they're so appalled by and opposed to are recent, novel cultural developments. But this claim just isn't true. People have been doing everything that they oppose throughout human history, more or less. So conservative abhorrence for all but a very narrow range of sexual behaviors and the really intense motivation that provides for overall political conflict can't really be plausibly subsumed under a general theme of aversion to change. It's a phenomena unto itself that deserves its own independent, unique explanation. And I think that it's also worth noting that political orientations are more like very broad narratives with psychological meaning than they are consistent sets of axioms that are rationally applied to any given situation. In the U.S., conservatives, for instance, have taken a bunch of positions that all amplify hierarchy, but in doing so contradict the self-definition of conservatism as a preservation of an existing social order. They amplify hierarchy, but in doing so move society into territory that there's no precedent for whatsoever. The current degree of economic inequality, the current rates of incarceration, these are things conservatives embrace and have created that don't have any precedent in the past whatsoever. And conservative lack of concern with environmental issues is really, in the terms conservatives use to define themselves, one of the least conservative orientations imaginable. Right? It's hard to think of a more wantonly perilous experiment than changing the chemical composition of the very atmosphere or denuding the oceans of life. So, I mean, really, if we're going to take conservatism literally and completely on its own terms, it would be fair to say that there's no more conservative political ideology than anarcho-primitivism, because it claims that the development of agriculture and everything that happened afterwards was a mistake. That's really conservative. But anyway, the fact that people don't have internally consistent beliefs doesn't negate the fact that they have beliefs. And these beliefs are hugely psychologically salient and provide a motivational basis for conflict. Conservatives tend to see society as deteriorating into chaos from a previous state of order and integration. And they tend to be really responsive to narratives about traditional values and traditional social arrangements, and to leaders restoring order and thwarting the impending chaos and decline. So whether the trajectory towards chaos is real or is happening for the reasons they think, or whether the imagined state of previous social order can be coherently described or located in any particular time or place, none of that really matters. I'm not claiming that political orientations are coherent applications of attitudes towards change and inequality. I'm just claiming that attitudes towards change and inequality are core motivating features of the psychology of right-left political conflict, however coherent or incoherent the ideologies that those psychologies produce are. So now, let's talk about all the differences between people which have no relationship in any explicit sense with politics whatsoever that correlate with political difference. So far, we've described one psychological trait, scores on the openness dimension of the Big Five, that's ideologically correlated. There's one other Big Five dimension, conscientiousness, which is likewise correlated with ideology, although not as strongly. And openness correlates with leftist orientation and conscientiousness with a right orientation. The 2003 paper that I described before pulls 9 psychological themes out of the literature which are ideologically correlated. Some of these 9 are pretty clearly and directly related to the general attitudes towards change aspect of political conflict. They in some sense describe a general psychological framework around which perceptions of novelty and uncertainty and whatnot exist. So those themes, those psychological themes from the 2003 paper are needs for order, structure, and closure, uncertainty tolerance, openness to experience, which we've already discussed, and perceptions of system instability in the society at large. But then none of the remaining 5 has anything like the same level of inevitable logical relationship with either attitudes towards change or attitudes towards inequality, or really with each other. And these themes are self-esteem, which is the weakest of the correlations, dogmatism and intolerance of ambiguity, fear of threat and loss, integrative complexity, which is a measure of the complexity of written and spoken language. And then with the very strongest correlation of any psychological variable the researchers could find, including having more predictive power than openness to experience, was personal fear of death. So those who fear death more are more right-wing, and those who are more right-wing are also more dogmatic and more fearful of threat and loss. And then self-esteem and integrative complexity are negatively correlated with right-wing ideology. And then, consistent with the findings of genetic research on the heritability of ideology and all the other evidence of political innateness that we've gotten into so far, some version of these psychological distinctions emerges very early on in life. A few decades ago, some researchers collected personality information on preschool children. And then 20 years later, they interviewed the adults they'd studied in preschool and asked about their political orientation. The 2 sets of data were very strongly correlated. And there's a really long list of personality traits that they produced really strong correlations with ideological scores for. They were using a metric called the California Q-Set personality scores. But just to illustrate, because the list of traits is in the dozens, but just to illustrate what some of these traits were like and how they do seem to have a sort of like obvious, even though they're different than the metrics being used in the 2003 paper by John Jost that I just referenced, how they do seem to have some like pretty obvious consistency with or application to those traits. So a few traits that they described in children that correlated with an adult right-wing ideology were inhibited and constricted, neat and orderly in dress, anxious in an unfamiliar environment, and having a readiness to feel guilty. And then a few of the traits which correlated, a few of the childhood personality traits which correlated with adult left-wing ideology were independent and autonomous, curious and exploring, and possessing a high intellectual capacity. And that last one is a particularly loaded difference to discuss. And for that reason, a lot of papers in political psychology just kind of avoid it or sort of dance around it. I guess I would say that feels like what John Jost and his co-authors were doing when they chose not to address IQ in their paper, but to use integrative complexity, the complexity of written and spoken language, as, what felt to me like kind of a proxy. But every handful of years, somebody does indeed do a study that correlates scores on IQ tests or other standardized metrics of intelligence with ideology. And there's exactly one study that I've been able to find that finds no relationship between political orientation and general intelligence, so overall scores on IQ tests, and actually found a positive correlation between conservatism and some aspects of IQ. So I think it was the block design and the digit symbols subcomponents of the WAIS. Then every other study that's been done in this domain has found a negative linear relationship between conservative ideology and IQ. And even though I am not generally in the business of making right-wing ideology sound any more coherent than it is, I do want to note that this difference is not simply because people who are more stupid are more prone to accepting right-wing narratives. Obviously, there's a wide range of intelligences that's found on either side of the ideological spectrum. There's some pretty solid evidence that having an active interest in politics of any kind with any orientation indicates more intelligence than maybe is found in, the baseline population. And there's plenty of overlap. There are certainly some people on the left with fewer cognitive resources than some people on the right. But these correlations, which, if you're a statistics person, tend to have Pearson's R coefficients a little under 0.20, are not at all trivial. And what these correlations indicate is that the biological processes which produce different core perceptual orientations, which map to political difference, are also producing statistically different levels of cognitive function. And what those processes are is what we're investigating in this series. And then cognitive studies provide converging evidence to the findings of psychological studies, which ultimately just rely on self-reporting. And cognitive studies can use some somewhat more objective metrics to establish a politically correlated difference in orientations towards risk and novelty, like unfamiliar territory and things like that. For instance, one study asked participants to play a game in which the accumulation of points required sampling unknown items. And ideology was pretty predictive of some very different strategies in the game. So people with more right-wing ideologies tended to play essentially like a very safe version of the game. They would discover a limited subset of items that they could accrue points with, and they would exclusively select those items throughout the game because the items could also, whatever objects they were clicking on a computer screen, could also incur a loss of points. So there was always a risk. There was both a potential risk and a potential reward in sampling an unknown item. And people with right-wing ideology tended to sample fewer unknown items. And then people with more left-wing ideologies tended to employ a higher risk, higher potential reward strategy where they would continuously, throughout the course of the game, sample novel items as they encountered them. And these kind of findings converge with the evidence of ideological correlations with brain structure and brain activity. So, again, in the domains of risk-taking and novelty and encounters with the unfamiliar. So during experimental risk-taking activities, conservatives exhibit more activation of the right amygdala. And the right amygdala is a brain region that's very fundamental to the experience of fear. And another study subjected participants to experimental conditions that required abandoning a habitual response. So first, it gave them some task that ended up essentially inculcating a habitual pattern of response, and then it varied the conditions so that they had to abandon it. And conservatives exhibited less activity when subject to the novel stimulus in the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. The ACC monitors conflict between habitual behavior and changing environmental conditions, so it promotes novel behavior in new circumstances to adapt to new conditions. And ideology not only predicts the activity of these brain regions, but also their absolute size. A 2012 brain imaging study found that those on the right have bigger amygdalae, and those on the left have bigger ACCs. The researchers then performed a subsequent study in which they looked at images of a different set of study participants' brains and predicted their voting behavior just by looking at their brains. And they were right a very statistically powerful amount of the time. They were right an amount of the time that would be exceedingly improbable if they weren't basing their predictions on some legitimate structural difference in the brains of people who vote differently. Now, because the amygdala produces fear, these findings about brain structure difference and brain activity differences converge with evidence from other studies on the relationship between threat responsiveness and threat attentiveness in political ideology. So one kind of research paradigm like this involves showing people faces with ambiguous expressions. And so it's like a computer generated face, and it could be yawning or it could be screaming in rage, stuff like that. Could be smiling, could be baring its teeth in an act of aggression. And people with more right-wing ideology are far more likely to classify faces with ambiguous facial expressions as threatening. Another study found that right-wingers are more distracted by images of threats, by images of things like sharks and hurricanes, when they're performing cognitive tests where they're supposed to perform some task that's, some unrelated task while being exposed to such images. There's been a couple of studies that have found that people with more right-wing ideology are more physiologically responsive as measured by skin conductance changes. So researchers put electrodes on people's foreheads, on their temples, and they measure the change in skin conductance, which is a good proxy for how physiologically aroused people are. And they found that people with more right-wing ideologies have a greater skin conductance change, are more physiologically responsive to threatening, angering, and disgusting images. So images of things like a bunch of maggots in a wound, or a crowd fighting a man, things like that, a spider on somebody's face. And they're more responsive to, one of these studies found that they're also more responsive as measured by blink amplitude, by how hard they blink, to sudden, loud, startling noises played through headphones. Then there was another study here in the domain of threat responsiveness and threat attentiveness and the relationship between fear and ideology that didn't have any of these kind of objective physiological or brain structural measures to use, but it was still very interesting, that just asked study participants to imagine themselves as physically invulnerable superheroes, as superheroes that couldn't be killed or physically harmed, and then to describe their politics from this imaginary state. And the researchers actually managed to get people to undergo a significant leftward shift in their politics just by having them engage in this imaginary exercise. And then, in addition to being less responsive or attentive to threat in cognitive and physiological tests, using the same kind of measurements of skin conductance change, those with left-wing politics are more physiologically responsive to images of things like cute kittens and happy children playing and bowls of fruit and stuff like that. So this distinction has led one group of researchers to describe right-wing psychology in general as aversive, and left-wing psychology as generally appetitive, right? So in other words, these are just very basic differences in perceptual orientation to stimulus, the tendency to sort of generally approach stimulus from the perspective that it's potentially harmful and unpleasant and should be avoided, versus a tendency to approach stimulus from a perspective that it's potentially interesting or appealing and should be approached, sort of like approach, avoid, paradigm distinction. And the themes of threat responsiveness and cognitive ability that we've talked about that are ideologically correlated converge with evidence from genetic studies that have looked beyond. Heritability studies just tell us the overall genetic contribution to a trait, but they don't tell us which genes are involved or how they produce the observed variation. But the work that's been done on the genetics underlying political orientation do converge with these other studies that show a difference in a politically correlated difference in threat responsiveness and cognitive ability. There's only been a few studies like this, but one was a genome-wide linkage scan. And it correlated ideology with variation in a number of chromosomal regions. And all the regions that correlated with high statistical power are inhabited by genes related to the production of a serotonin receptor, which is implicated in the maturation of the brain, in the development of cognitive ability, especially social cognitive ability, and the regulation of fear. Okay, and so right-left distinctions in comfort with novelty and need for structure and predictability also manifest in people's living situations. So there was a study that just like evaluated people's living spaces and found that people with more right-wing ideologies tend to have more ordered and more clean environments, and they tend to have more cleaning supplies. And then people with more left-wing ideologies have living spaces that have more kind of like more forms of stimulus, like more books and music, more things to explore. And then interestingly, they have more materials related to travel, whether it's like maps and travel guides and like mementos from far-off lands and things like that. And the same study looked at interaction styles, and it found some pretty interesting differences in how people interact in conversations. It found that people with more right-wing ideology showed less variation in facial expression and less eye contact, and were kind of just like generally less expressive in their interactions with people. And then findings that we've already discussed about different levels of comfort with ambiguity and dogmatism, right, in the 2003 meta-analysis of John Jost and others. These findings converge with evidence of different patterns of media consumption on the right and the left. So, of course, a lot of people are always commenting on the general trend towards polarization in our society, but there's actually some really highly asymmetrical features of the polarization that's occurring that aren't noted as often. And the best research that I found about this is a 2017 study that mapped the network structure of the internet media landscape. And it found that the left information ecosystem encompasses a much like greater ideological breadth, which means that visitors to any given site in the left information sphere, or whatever you want to call it, tend to visit other sites that have pretty disparate ideological frameworks and epistemologies and are invoking different sets of information and coming to different conclusions using different forms of reasoning. And then the right-wing media landscape is simply smaller. It's just a smaller number of sites. And these sites are more ideologically homogeneous. The right-wing media landscape is a more self-referential entity that tends to reinforce perspectives more consistently and reliably. There's fewer points of disagreement within it. And then perhaps, I think the final study that we'll cite in this review, and perhaps I don't know, maybe most decisively indicating that there's a fundamental underlying difference between people that maps to political difference, Republicans and Democrats can be differentiated by their faces. That's the name of a 2010 study. Republicans and Democrats can be differentiated by their faces. And the researchers showed some study participants the senior yearbook photos of people that they had voter registration data for, college, like I think senior college yearbook photos, and asked them to guess whether these were photos of Republicans or Democrats without giving them any information other than the photograph of their faces. And the study participants were able to classify faces as Republican or Democrat with a degree of accuracy that would have been vanishingly improbable if they weren't discerning a real physical difference. And in the words of the researchers, the study participants described Republican faces as, quote, more commanding and masculine, and the Democrat faces as more agreeable. And we will return to this. So I've described the findings of all these studies pretty rapidly without really describing the methods at all. And because I do think that these are conclusions that people aren't necessarily going to be terribly amenable to in a lot of cases, I don't necessarily expect that people will invariably assume that the methods underlying these studies are sound. And so, obviously if you want exacting, rigorous methodological detail in all the detail that a research paper can provide, you got to read the papers, and you can find the citations on my website. But if you want to read one scientific paper that reviews I think pretty much every single study that I just described, and a bunch of similar related studies that I haven't mentioned, and does go into a lot more detail about methods, I would really recommend a review written by John Hibbing and others called Differences in Negativity Bias Underlie Variations in Political Ideology. It was published in 2014 in the journal Brain and Behavioral Sciences. Okay, so I think that a bunch of questions leap out at us from this landscape of scientific findings that I've just described. And for purposes of this series, I'm essentially going to focus on 3 of the questions that occur to me from reading all this. I think that the first is why attitudes toward hierarchy and attitudes towards social change are so predictive of one another. In other words, why aren't there some people, in some instances of right-left conflict, where increased inequality is promoted explicitly along with a radical departure from tradition? Or conversely, why aren't there more people who are uncomfortable with change and risk and novelty, but who also oppose hierarchy and who see it, pretty validly as a source of risk? These are perfectly logically conceivable positions, but they're just really not very empirically common. And there's no really clear inherent relationship between hierarchy and change, but the empirical reality is that right-left conflict plays out as a conflict between reliably clustered perceptions of these unrelated dimensions. So, the C scale asks questions about empire building as well as questions about modern art, right, about hierarchy as well as change and novelty. And likewise, the right-wing authoritarianism scale asks questions about or makes statements about silencing troublemakers as well as making statements about tradition. And then if we add sexuality, the other dimension that I've talked about of recurrent right-left conflict, to the mix, the lack of logical inevitability of the clustering of these perceptions, I think, becomes even more clear. None of these things really inherently and inevitably has anything to do with any of these other things. And then the next question that I'd ask is just what all the other traits that have been found to correlate with ideology have to do with either one another or with political perceptions. Why do people with more cleaning supplies also have lower IQ and also support invasions and border walls? Why do people who have a stronger desire for novelty and stimulation also have less fear of death and also support environmental protections? Right? And then, of course, the third and final broad question that I'm going to try to answer in this series is just where all this variation in all these idiosyncratic traits ultimately comes from. We know something biological is happening from all this literature I've just described, but what is it? But before I begin making my case for the answers to these questions, I want to add one more dimension of right-left conflict that I think is a pretty perennial and fundamental distinction that the existing research literature doesn't very explicitly or commonly address. And that distinction is in levels of aggression. There are actually a bunch of other empirical idiosyncrasies of the right-left divide that I'm going to talk about after I've proposed my theory, because the theory predicts them, I think. But I think that this one of aggression helps contextualize the type of biology that I'm going to talk about next. And there's a huge number of ways that right-left variation and aggression manifests. This is a time of great polarization in the U.S. and a time of great mutual incomprehensibility between the right and the left. But there's only one side that's actually killing people. A report by the Anti-Defamation League documents every politically motivated murder committed in the U.S. in 2018. And there were 50 murders by far right-wingers, and there were 0 murders by far left-wingers. A related phenomenon is the huge number of militias in this country, which are almost exclusively a right-wing phenomenon. The left-wing militia kind of ostensibly exists, but it's a very, very, very small proportion of the overall militias in this country. And this variation in attitudes toward violence is also found in explicit movement strategy. A huge extent of the activist left operates on a theory of social change that is explicitly nonviolent. They operate on a theory of social change that prescribes confronting even the most heavily armed and atrocity-prone forces with a loving heart and empty hands. And there's absolutely no counterpart to this strategy of nonviolence, of absolute programmatic nonviolence on the activist right. This distinction and aggressiveness also manifests in the broad political positions the right and the left take on the objectives one either is or isn't willing to use violence to achieve. Opposition to war has been a defining, enduring feature of leftist politics for generations, and support for the same wars has been a core basis for cohesion and solidarity on the right. The death penalty is another example of ideologically correlated variation in attitudes towards acts of lethal violence and towards aggression, as is the entire phenomenon of policing and the administration of criminal justice. Police officers tend to have right-wing politics, and right-wingers tend to support the police. And there absolutely is no left-wing counterpart to these forces in our society. All of these phenomena that I just described killing people for a political end as a kind of niche extremist, invading countries on the national level, patrolling the streets as a cop looking for lawbreakers, locking these lawbreakers up and executing some of them. All of these are acts of aggression. And aggression has a biology. So in the next part of this series, I'm going to examine what this biology is and how it so perfectly describes the idiosyncratic constellation of behavioral and perceptual distinctions that characterizes the right-left divide. So until that time, friends, thank you so very much for listening, and stay well, and I will see you soon.